Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. Today I'm speaking with Arsalan Khan about the Promise of Piety, an extraordinary ethnography of the Tablighi Jamaat in Pakistan. The Tablighi Jamaat is a transnational Islamic revival movement rooted in South Asia. It doesn't focus on politics or theology. It centers on ethical self-transformation through Dawat or moral invitation. It calls ordinary Muslims to leave their everyday lives, often for days or weeks, and engage in face-to-face ethical labor. This isn't a movement of sermons from above. It's an embodied practice of piety from below. In a time when Islam is often reduced to threat or private belief, Khan's work insists on the complexity of religious practice, its moral grammars, hierarchies, and world-building power. If you find conversations like this meaningful, like, share, and subscribe. And support the work at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Arslan, it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. Yeah. Hot in Karachi, but
So I want to begin with this question. In both your book and the two article, you reframe piety not as an interior belief or doctrinal submission, but as a practice structured through temporality, repetition, and relationality. Why was this reconceptualization of piety necessary? And what does it make visible that older anthropologies of Islam did not?
I mean, it's certainly in the tradition of the work of the category of religion, which centrally within anthropology, especially was the work of Talal Asad. Asad's, seminal argument was that the domain or category of religion presupposes certain liberal and secular assumptions about what religion is, what counts as religion, what doesn't count as religion, and then later, right, and that this kind of emerges as a feature of secular ideology or liberal ideology, and thus of modernity, and that and later that this becomes a kind of under secular regimes, which we tend to normally think of as being neutral towards religion, but in fact, Asad argued that it turns religion into an object of regulation. So out of that tradition came a series of important anthropological works, the very famous works by Saba Mahmood and Charles Erskine, that all looked through the paradigm of Foucault's idea of ethical self-cultivation, looked at that embodied practices are means through which within the Islamic tradition, the idea is not that Islamic practice is not just like a representation of an already given self, a prior existing self, but instead a means through which the self is cultivated and created. I think that I do make a critique of the Foucauldian paradigm because I think that sometimes, and this is not, I don't have an overtly harsh critique of it because, I think that the Foucauldian framework sometimes reduces piety to a kind of individual acting on themselves. I don't think that's entirely fair to both the works of Saba Mahmood and Charles Erskine, but I do think that in some way that work backgrounds the dialogical, interactional nature of pious, both self-formation and community formation. And so my book is an intervention into that, and I add, I think, to this Asadian paradigm. I both critique it, but I also add to it this kind of, like locating piety in its interactional forms. And I argue basically that when we look at the way that the religion or the sphere of religion is constituted within its religious movements, Islamic movements, right, we get into the sort of particularity of the ways in which both selves are constructed, but also religion as a domain, deen, and this sort of difference that I examine between deen and dunya within the Tablighi Jamaat, how that is institutionalized. On the basis of that, we can understand the political valence of such movements. And so that is the overall aim of the book, to understand the interactional basis for the creation of piety, pious selves, and pious community formation, and what I call pious relationality, the way in which people interact with each other and understand themselves to be part of the world.
Thank you for this introduction. And I want to begin with your engagement of Talal Asad's notion of tradition as a discursive formation. But you emphasize aspiration, moral striving, and ethical possibility far more than stability and continuity that's seen in Asad's work. Where do you see yourself extending Asad's legacy, and where might you depart from it?
I think that within that legacy, sometimes what happens is that the notion of an Islamic tradition or discursive tradition becomes too kind of reified. Now, I don't dismiss there are certainly some people whose critique of Asad is that the notion of a discursive tradition, or maybe I'll say a little bit about the notion of a discursive tradition that everybody's not familiar. So Asad famously argued in an essay, I believe it's Towards an Anthropology of Islam, where he lays out this idea of a discursive tradition, and he argues that a discursive tradition is a tradition of a Muslim practices relative to a sort of past, right? So the way in which people in the present create a relationship to the sacred past by drawing on certain forms of sacred sources that authorize a particular practice in the present. And I actually think that that's a fairly reasonable way to understand tradition, right? But I think that sometimes what happened in this work as it moves into anthropological studies of actual Islamic movements is that tradition takes on this really sort of overarching, really heavy, I think, presence, and it already predetermines the types of movements and the types of things that should be the objects of analysis, right? And so I think that I work from what I would call a more ground-up perspective. I argue for a semiotic perspective that allows us to tease out the micro-practices through which subjects are formed and particular visions of community are created. And I do think those fit in a broader Islamic tradition because, of course, they're drawing on some of the means of the past. So I think that ability to ground the Islamic practices in interactional space opens up some space to think about community formation and interactional forms, ideologies of sovereignty and collectivity and so on.
I felt your emphasis on this aspiration, failure, and ethical becoming in relation to your research subject, which is the Tablighi Jamaat, adds this forward-looking dimension. In a way, you seem to move from the tradition as continuity, but tradition as a possibility. Does that shift a signal of a new kind of moral anthropology in your mind?
I mean, I think that's an excellent point on which I think there's space for a good amount of discussion and debate. I think that there's some sense in which the notion of tradition foregrounds continuity in that literature, and a lot of anthropologists drawing on that tradition. And if you look at religious studies and the way that Asad has been popularized in religious studies, very important, interesting work. I think that you do get a sense from a lot of that work that there's a lot of sort of continuity between the colonial and pre-colonial and modern and pre-modern past. And there's this sort of like, even though Asad's argument is presentist, Muslims are making and remaking their tradition in conversation with each other and creating this linkage to the past constantly. When you really get into the work, it does feel like there's a kind of argument of continuity. And I feel like my work has sort of departs from that, in that I'm really interested in the way that modernity reformulates. So I feel like I'm more of a change person than a continuity person. And I think there's space for all of us in this kind of debate about what these movements are. I do make the case that there's a way in which what is being formulated within the Tablighi Jamaat in terms of ethical subjectivity, community formation, all these practices have a greater indebtedness to secular modernity and modernity than has been, at least in some of that literature, been recognized. And that it shares kind of, the modernity shares things with other modernities. Joel Robbins, the anthropologist Joel Robbins, said that, we sometimes talk about vernacular modernities in a lot of literature, but nobody actually says, well, what's the modernity part of the vernacular? We focus on the vernacular, but what are the things that connect the modernities that make them modernities? And so I actually emphasize that point, that there's this notion of a direct relationship to transcendental power that a subject, an individual, a person can formulate. How we formulate that direct relationship to transcendental power is subject to all kinds of questions of community, tradition, and political economy. Like, what is it that people are trying to achieve when they lay claim to transcendence? So I end up with this kind of argument about modernity and modernities and the piety formation of the Tablighi Jamaat is a particular variance of a broader thematic that runs across modernities, including Christian or Jewish or even secular. And so my interest is in that more comparative dimension of modernities that emerge in the colonial period, and the historical chapters in my book about the rise of these modernities. So I think that's also a site of a bit of a tension between my work and that work, to which, as I always say, I'm a friendly critic in the sense that I actually respect that work a lot, and I drew on it as well. So I'm not one. There are definitely certain people who are much more dismissive of it. I feel like I'm trying to engage that work on its terms, and I depart from it in these particular ways.
You present the ethical subject not as coherent or completed, but as perpetually becoming. Why was it important for you to foreground the ethical subject in this manner?
That's a great question. I mean, I do think that the type of subjectivity that is being imagined, the type of community and subjectivity, both that are being tried to imagine, are very elusive, right? I mean, there is a sense, again, linked to my notion of as a modernity of this purification of the sphere of religion and of these other aspects of life, which are constantly then frustrating that project. So it's like this object that people are chasing after, aspiring towards, but is a very difficult thing to realize because it does the level of commitment that it requires. And so I think that maybe the way to think about it is that I have both a sympathetic and a critical take on the Piety Project, which is I recognize the work it does in people's lives in the way that it reformulates their sense of place in the world and so on. But I think it runs up constantly against limits that threaten and challenge it. And thus it requires enclosing yourself from people that are, for instance, different from you, that threaten your piety. So piety is something formulated, but is also something constantly threatened by these other potentialities that exist in Pakistan, this diversity, of plurality of possibilities of being Muslim, of being non-Muslim, or being all these other things, in terms of ethnicity, caste, and all these other possibilities. And so I think that there was a general, if I could just broaden the point I'm making, is that there was, against that same literature, that Asadian literature, there was a kind of critique that came from what comes to be known as everyday Islam. I lay out the kind of parameters of this debate within my introduction. And with that criticism was that there's almost too much emphasis on Islamic tradition and Islam in Muslim life, but actually there's so much more going on in Muslim life. And I think that that's fair, right? Like, we know from our experiences in a country like Pakistan, Islam is this ever-present thing, but it cannot be right? There are all of these other potentialities of subject formation and stuff, and other modernities that compete with that, and therefore not just secular or liberal ones too. The things that run through the book are, saint veneration, right, and Sufism, and other formulations of the transcendent in different maslaks and different denominations of Sunniism and Shiism and so on. So Pakistan's an immensely plural place. So I think that why I wanted to emphasize those limits and that difficulty and that striving, but also the contradictions and difficulties of materializing that vision, is because people move in and out of movements like this, and they are constantly subject to frustrations and limits, and sometimes people entirely abandon them, and sometimes people. So I think that once you ground the tradition sociologically, and you find that many possibilities emerge. So people are trying to enclose this notion of piety and this purity idea of a pure religiosity, but it's frustrated by material realities and other possibilities of conceptions of subjectivity and sovereignty.
I want to dwell on Dawat for a second. You show that it isn't simply a sermon or form of persuasion. It's a material embodied practice of ethical invitation. How do Jamaat members learn to do Dawat, and what kinds of ethical relationships does it create?
This is, at the center of the book is really a kind of micro-analysis of these processes, right? And ritual processes of Dawat. I make an argument, one, that we cannot understand subject formation without understanding the kind of institutional structure within which that people produce in practice, right? And so Dawat is more than a practice on the self of the individual. It actually formulates a whole as a scholar reads, Tariq reads, called it a faith bureaucracy. There's a whole bureaucracy structure that is produced in the Dawat that organizes the Dawat, which in turn then formulates the subject as they practice this Dawat. And so I focused on hierarchical arrangement. So the Tablighi Jamaat is an egalitarian formation in the sense that all Muslims, or at least male Muslims, there's a sort of gender hierarchy. The women have a whole realm that they also participate in. Right, that all Muslims technically should participate in this because this is the practice that God has bequeathed to humans to create that relationship to transcendence and to cultivate faith, right? So they call it the mother of practices, ulama, right? It's the practice of practices. And so that idea is that any Muslim who wants to cultivate faith and create a relationship to transcendence must partake in the Dawat as a embodied practice. But in that process of Dawat, I argue, even though there's this egalitarian premise, it creates these ranked hierarchies, a hierarchy between new companions who haven't done a 4-month tour and old companions. And there's a whole kind of symbolism around these thresholds of difference of pious ascendants. So I look at the institutional structure of that process where you preach to others, but you also become a listener to those more pious than oneself. So you're supposed to preach outwards, and that's supposed to shape you. They say when you preach to others, it creates those virtues in yourself. But in the process, they also formulate this kind of institutional hierarchy. So I got really interested in this question of the hierarchization of this structure through which one creates a relationship to transcendence. So one of the arguments I make is that Dawat is a practice of self-cultivation in relationship to others, but it creates these kind of layered, tiered connections to the divine. And then also that then there's a practice of, this is why there's such a strong emphasis in the Tablighi Jamaat on collectivity, on the Jamaat, right? Which is the preaching congregation. And so congregational life is so important. And in congregational life, one comes to be a pious subject by recognizing the authority of those more pious than oneself and indexing that or citing that in everyday practice. And so there is a conception of agency that defers the agency of this to the other and creates these kind of relationships of hierarchy that I describe in the kind of crux in the center 2 chapters of the book. And I argue that there's a notion of pious companionship in the Tablighi Jamaat in which one defers. It's a kind of a practice of deferment, an awkward term called the ethics of hierarchy. I could have called it ethics of deference or whatever it is. It involves deference to others, and it involves deference in 2 senses. One is to literally defer to the authority of those more pious than yourself, and you have to learn and cultivate that ability to recognize piety in others or virtue in others, but also to defer the project of the realization of pious authority to the future. So you don't want to assume too much authority you don't have yet. And so this idea of the disciplined self that can defer to those more pious than oneself, but also defer to the future when you're unable to realize that piety in the present. So it's this constant process of pushing the realization of the moment of piety to the future. So it's looking forward constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, another element within the book is your engagement with Saba Mahmood. Saba Mahmood's politics of piety foregrounded or emphasized autonomy through discipline and submission, to argue that pious subjects are formed through embodied practice and not liberal agency. But your project seems to again shift the sort of terrain on which the politics of piety exists, in the sense that from submission to a relational invitation. And would you call your work, how do you engage with Saba Mahmood in the book? And what is your critique of how agency is framed in Islamic ethics?
Yeah, I think actually I agree with that. So my focus on hierarchy is actually similar in the sense that I do recognize that that's a type of formation of agency that is different from liberal individualism. Is about, though in the end you can see in my conclusion, I also argue that liberalism also formulates these kinds of relationships. So maybe we have too narrow a conceptualization of liberalism. But I do think that there is something about individualism that is at the center of the bourgeois subject, the individual subject, and the autonomy of the individual subject that is really central to liberal ideology. And it is a type of mystification of these hierarchies. It is central. And and that isn't right the notion of sovereignty as mediated through this particular community formation on the model of the prophet that involves submission to these authorities is something that's non-liberal. But it also differs from other Islamic movements, right? There are many Islamic movements that look at the Tablighi Jamaat's formulation of this problem, right? This formulation and the particularity of it, precisely the type of Salafi movements that actually that are the focus of Saba Mahmood's work in Egypt are actually not as explicitly hierarchical as the Tablighi Jamaat is, which is not as explicitly hierarchical as many Brahmi movements are, or certainly Sufi or Shia, right? Imamate and stuff. So these are all kind of debates about the autonomy of the subject relative to authority that exists within Islam and within all kinds of religious formations or between them. And so I think that I focus in on a particular thing. Saba was kind enough to read my first article on this, which is on the ethics of hierarchy. And she said, yeah, this is not in that work, right? Like that explicitness of hierarchy formation that happens in a very institutionalized way in the way, because the Salafi movements are a bit more diffused, the type that she's studying. So these are all different formulations of the problem of how to manage a relationship or materialize a relationship to God in a direct way that make these movements part of modernity, but they are modernities. This is where my focus is. They're formulated in this different kind of these different ways. And I think the semiotics argument I make allows us to materialize and really visualize and see how the effort to materialize that is the source of the politics of piety. Piety as a sphere is contested in all these ways by what counts or does not count as religion, what does or does not materialize a relationship to transcendental power. And that is a debate about authority as well, which is a pervasive feature of life in Pakistan. So, this is, again, I reiterate this because I've been in spaces where I think there's like this dismissiveness of the arguments of some people. And I find that work very helpful to think with. And I've tried to think with it, but I've also tried to think about this movement in this place in Pakistan yields an analysis that requires us, one, to contend with the diverse plurality of forms of modernities and the contestation over those forms, right? And two, the fact that Pakistan is, of course, an Islamic state and therefore has a state religion against which and in relationship to which, and all of the things that you see that run through the book that ground it in the space of Pakistan's social and political crisis, which is what the backdrop of the Tablighi project I examined.
I want to shift a little bit to your experience during field work. You mentioned that Jamaat members didn't treat you as neutral observers, but as someone who should be morally transformed. What did it feel like to become the object of Dawat in the field?
Yeah, no, that's a big part of the book, and thank you, you brought it up. It's a theme. I argue that this is in ethnography. I call it in the space of cultural intimacy, and one of the reasons I frame it that way is because I really do think like these divides between liberal, secular, and Islamic, they exist. We know they exist, secular, Mark. There are all of these ways in which we're all related to each other, right? Our cousins are Tablighis, and I met Marxists who speak almost in an idiom that sounds like Tablighis, and then you find out his brother is in the Tablighi Jamaat. So Pakistan is full of these kinds of possibilities of interactions that cannot be boxed, I think, in the way that we box them. And so I argue that, this is anthropology in the space of cultural intimacy in the sense that these are transformative possibilities, right? There are transformative possibilities of somebody being secular and becoming part of a Tablighi movement, or somebody becoming a Tablighi and then leaving it and becoming something entirely different. And so because they're modernities, see, if they were not modernities, if they didn't have some underlying structural similarities, right, you couldn't just transform from one to the other, but people do. And that already is a good sign that actually what we're dealing with are more intimate space. We're dealing with intimate differences.
Yeah.
Rather than really radical ruptures. And so I make an argument against radical alterity. So that's the kind of broad frame. I do that through a story of a very good high school friend of mine, A-levels friend of mine.
Yeah.
Was a feature of the whole research process. So in the Tablighi Jamaat, you're a Muslim. If you bring in a Muslim identity and maybe even a non-Muslim identity, obviously, you're presupposed as somebody who is to be incorporated into this project, like all Muslims
Yeah.
are. And then you're there and you're present. And so you've already shown interest. But Tabligis have a very embodiment is not just an analytic category. Embodiment is a native category in the sense that the Tabligis themselves think about religion as non-intellectual, right? Like the body that they construct as a site of the construct. So they say, oh, you cannot understand Islamic piety through the brain or Zen, right? They say, oh, it's not a dimaghi thing. It's not a thing of the mind only, right? It's a thing of the body. And so they have a theory of the body and the body's transformation is part of their religiosity. And so they saw my research as an obstacle to my realization of piety itself.
Yeah.
And so in that was a big part of my story was like understanding how Islamic piety is embodied has to take account of these kinds of differences that they themselves produce between mind and body and the formulation of the body as a site for this different kind of mindfulness, right? And so my
Yeah.
research was both ran against this ideology insofar as I was, on the one hand, asking too many questions, And so one of the things about the submission to authority, the recognition of authority, is not to become a speaker too soon. But I was always talking because I had questions, but they would say, you cannot understand it like this. Islam is understood through orthopraxy, through to doing. So they would say this to me, and I was asking all these questions, and I was making other people respond to questions intellectually. And so there was a whole theory that the devil is what manipulates the mind in such a way, or speech in such a way as to then make people raise questions. And so, in fact, I was I was myself. My ethnographic project was antithetical to the project of the materialization or production of a pious subjectivity. So
Uh,
this was a tension that ran through my fieldwork, and I explore this tension because it actually gets at what it is when I say Tablighi Jamaat has a particular conception of the sphere of deen, of religion. This is the kind of tension that gets at that, right? The speaking subject is assuming authority, a self-authorized person as assuming authority that he doesn't or doesn't have at the moment, right, to speak in certain authoritative ways. And therefore, I was, in a sense, seen as the same problem that they would see in liberalism, right? That it authorizes people. So I think it's in keeping, I think, broadly with this, the Asadian point here that, but I don't take their ideology. I think that maybe one way in which to think about the differences, I think that when I start to ask this question about why does their piety get threatened and unravel by these questions, it does open some space for thinking about the limits of their own worldview, right? I don't reject their worldview as false entirely, but I also don't accept it as actually embodying the totality of the social truth, right? You can think about this in the word we think about in Marxist tradition, ideology, right? Like it is ideology in the sense that it's not entirely false, but it also does not encompass the totality of the truth to which it is an attempt to engage. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which I was thinking about this problem. That didn't I was a threat to that framework, right? By virtue of my presence in that. And so I use myself as a vehicle for thinking about what are the things that threaten this formation, this social formation, this ethical formation.
and to expand on that further, so how did these encounters reshape your fieldwork relationships, not just in terms of access, but in terms of the ethics of doing fieldwork? And what kind of responsibilities did they place on you as a researcher, I guess you could say?
Well, they didn't want me to be a researcher. They wanted me to be a not researcher, and that some of them understood and maybe were okay with it. Some of them found it extremely odd and threatening. And so I think that the idea was, of course, though, that I had a Tablighi Buzurg had in some way tacitly authorized me to be there because maybe I don't know, I can only speculate why, and I do speculate a bit about why. But in my book, which is that I think that there was a sense that I would eventually be affected by this in a way that would transform me in the way that they saw, and then I could myself become a vehicle for the transformation of others. And there is a class and caste kind of framework that I explore in the book as well, that, like there is a desire to get people who are high up already in worldly kind of ways, right? Because those people have an influence on others. And if you can attract enough people like that, generals, army generals, or elites, or that can have a profound transformation on others around them, right? So it boosts the prestige value of the Jamaat. And so I think that maybe there were a lot of things going on and efforts to draw me in, and so I think that's what they approached. That is what most people thought would happen. I mean, otherwise, I explore this in the book at length. There were personal relationships that I had with some of the people guiding me through my research as well. But I had decent relationships. I think that we developed these relationships. Obviously, I didn't include private things too many. I included what I felt I needed to include, but I also wasn't trying to get into things that I really. So you manage that ethics in ethnography, and you try. It's not like I'm trying to expose some, but people in Pakistan in general think that when you're doing research, they think you're trying to get at some kind of secret thing. But actually, my research was on the surface of things, right? The surfaces are what are interesting about.
Yeah. No, I was just going to add that these accounts of Dawat are drawn from multiple people's stories. When does composition such as blending voices or moments feel more truthful than sticking to one person's account? And how do you decide when to compose in that way? And were there any ethical considerations?
I'm not sure I wrote that. I don't recall that, but I do think that there is some blending, but it's not that much blending. I mean, it's not like but it is true that in ethnography there are somewhat composite characters, right? That is to say, you do you hear so many things, and you can't tell a story about every single person, or you have to drive an account through events, right? Like this happened, and so things here and there, and you do that. I mean, you don't end up. I mean, I don't have any quotes of people that are not those people, there's some level of story building and to create a coherent account. So I tell the students this all the time. This is true that you do need to build chapters around particular types of characters and particular types of people, and there are things that you're learning from your environment. But I mean the authenticity comes from, the quotations are almost like those are mostly recorded either right there in notes, or some of them were actually interview recorded. So I think that there are no completely like accounts of like one person, but all characters are somewhat composites, right? Because I'd have to go through all the text particularly to see which parts maybe somebody said it in a different place. The same person said it, but they said it in two different spaces. But you're not going to write a whole other scene over there. So that's how ethnography does work, and it isn't. I mean, I think that it's not certainly not like writing fiction. You are writing about real people who said real things to you in a real space, and events that happened are all, of course, very much. So there's a bit of liberty, but there's not as much liberty as some people think there might be.
So returning to Dawat, your concept of moral chronotype, especially in your Polar article, describes how pious time collapses sacred past and aspirational future. What does this temporality do for Jamaat's members on the ground?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. That article is in, you've said Polar again, but it's in Science and Society.
Science and Society? I'll just write that down.
But one of the arguments I make, of course, is that there's this sort of temporality that's produced, right? This temporality of piety, both in the sense that I already said, which is this deference to the future, but also in the replication and reproduction of the Prophet's time in this sort of relation. So the Tablighi Jamaat it's what do we call it? The anarchists call it. It's prefigurative politics, right? It's prefigurative in the sense that it shares that you're trying to produce the ideal society in the here and now as it was in the past, and trying to collapse the temporality of the present into that past, right? And you're trying to do that through embodied practice. And so I draw on a lot of semiotic stuff, but argue iconicity. Iconicity is basically signs that look like things that look like other things, basically signs that are related to other things by a physical resemblance of sorts. So the Tablighi Jamaat is replicating the Sunnat, right? And so it's materializing the Prophet's time in the present and through this kind of replication. And the interactional forms that I describe are replicating the relations between the Prophet and the companions, right? Which are also these tiered relationships relative to the personage of the Prophet. And so yeah, I argue that kind of effort to replicate temporality. But then there's also this sort of futurism, which is that you don't really ever arrive at it, right? You kind of is a sort of deference of that to the future. What does it do? Well, one thing it does functionally, I argue, is that it affords a certain possibility for living in plural space. Is an argument I make in that one chapter. That is to say that the ideal society would involve producing a family, community writ large, but a family also that already abides by the very strict terms of Islamic piety as they've been formulated in this tradition, Tablighi Jamaat and in the broader Deobandi tradition. But families are, of course, mixed. They don't actually exist like that. People are actually willful and they don't all often have the same, even some people don't even, the same families don't even belong to the same denominations. And so there are all these tensions that arrive in people's lives by virtue of their inability to realize the ideal form, right, of the family, which I argue it is about hierarchy of where familial hierarchy, which we're all familiar with in Pakistan, listening to your elders, your parents, your grandparents, that familial hierarchy, particularly the father's voice in a patriarchal structure, right, aligns with the hierarchy of the Tablighi congregation. Those two hierarchies must align, which means that you have religious authority, paternal authority, and then you, right? You should have this clear line of authority that goes from you to your parents to the elders of the. But this doesn't happen. These alignments don't happen, right? Relations are complex. We live in a complex plural social milieu, and with some of our most intimate relationships, those relationships that define who we are do not, in fact, materialize that. So this can produce anxiety and frustration. If you're a Marxist, to put it simply, you're a Marxist, but your father is a card-carrying capitalist, a certain kind of contradiction is produced inside of you, right? That contradiction can unravel in many directions, right? It can produce all kinds of things. So it's not different from any kind of social milieu where kinship is really important to the conception of yourself and how other people perceive you. And so Tablighis have to manage this problem because they're trying to produce this idealized society and idealized state, but they run up against these social limits. And so one of the arguments I make is this notion of deference that is produced within the Tablighi Jamaat allows for a certain kind of acceptance of difference, because it's ultimately God that transforms people. And so there's a certain kind of deference, like maybe my father is not accepting of what I do, but maybe he will be in the future through the agency of God. So it structures their relationships to other people, and it allows you to then accept to relative degrees a certain amount of plurality that we all have to develop. So that is one of the arguments I make about the function of that temporality in the larger arc, and that's how a movement can globalize, right? If you want to think about the globalization of religious forms, it requires a certain ethics of reflection on the limits of agency. I can't necessarily transform you, but I must still live with you. It's a kind of attempt. And this is what explains in my argument some of the great successes of Tablighi Jamaat that operate across all kinds of social and political landscapes. Their ability to embed themselves, pursue their project of producing a kind of pious formation, social formation, while living in the actual plurality of social forms.
You write about fitna as a personal and collective crisis. How does Dawat function as a response to disorder? And what kind of social repair does it aim to produce?
Sorry, you cut off a little bit. Can you repeat that last bit again?
And what kind of social repair does it aim to produce?
Yeah, so I think that, so maybe I should say a little about the back. Really, key things about the book that I'm interested in is, Pakistan is, it has many crises, right? And these crises are not, are explained by, all the things of the political economy that we recognize. It has a conception of Islamic sovereignty, and that Islamic sovereignty and Islamic unity runs against all kinds of ethnic identities and ethnic formations, right? And the state captures Islam and uses that sovereignty as a kind of unifying ideology, and it brings together certain classes of people. And so we can do an analysis of the political. I'm interested in the Tablighi's response to what I would say are these objective conditions of crisis that I think are formulated in the nation state and at the intersection of nationalism and democracy and capitalism and so on. So I became really interested in this idea of fitna and moral chaos as it relates to what are the crises. And Karachi, as you know, is one of the sort of centers of this fragmentation that Karachi is both the most cosmopolitan place, but it's also been rife with violence and tension between ethnic communities. And so because my research is situated in Karachi, I became really interested in this question of how Tablighis understand and relate to the pride problems, right? And of course, their fundamental claim is that Muslims are at each other's throat because Muslims are not connected to deen. They're not connected to religion. They've lost their connection to religion, and therefore all the chaos you see, and they say chaos exists within families, between husbands and wives, between brothers, fighting over property, all things we all recognize to be social, important, relevant realities. It exists at the level of the family. It exists at the level of communities, ethnic communities who are all at loggerheads and in conflict. It exists at the level of nations, Muslim nations that cannot coordinate activities. And so they see this fragmentation, the political fragmentation of Pakistan and the broader Muslim world, as an embodiment of the Islamic concept of fitna, right? Which is, right, this idea of kind of chaos and particularly as it relates to conflict. So they have this notion that the pious formation that they're creating is the basis for the management of conflict and the management of violence by producing pious subjects who have self-control and can relate to each other as Muslims in a transcendental way beyond ethnicity and beyond these things. And so a lot of the Tablighi Jamaat's work is about looking at that, including crime and these other things. It's just all lumped together as religion is posited and Islam is posited as the solution to that. So that's their idea of repair, right? Like the relations that we're formulating here are idealized relations, and we look out in the dunya, deen and dunya, the difference, right? That we look out in the world, and the world out there is part of this chaos, and they explain that chaos is a product of this quest for power and the naked quest for money and power and all of these things. And it's deen that disciplines the subject, that allows power to be materialized in the world in an ethical way. So they're trying to ground the political. It's not that they're apolitical, but they're trying to ground the political in the moral formation, right? And produce subjects. So they think that that is a vehicle for producing not just communal harmony, but also producing ultimately a state that can in reality materialize the idea of collectivity, Jamaat, and community, and so forth, right? And so they set this up against the actual existing state, Pakistani state, which they see as a principal source of all of this crisis. So that's their idea of sovereignty. The sovereignty produced within the religious formation is going to then anchor morally these other powers. It's going to discipline these powers just like it disciplines itself. And then that collectivity that is imagined as an Islamic collectivity, a universal Islamic collectivity, can then emerge out of this process. So that's their understanding of repair at the level of families, at the level of communities, at the level of...
Hierarchy is central to your framing, not as a coercive authority, but as an aspirational, like moral orientation. Why was it important for you to preserve hierarchy as a core analytic rather than flattening the ethical field, I guess you could say?
Great question. I think that we really need to tease out, when we think about the political, we, right, include you, me, people on the left, we obviously want a more egalitarian society, more gender egalitarianism, I do. you do, right? Any of us do. And so we have this conception of equality, and we want that equality, and we think that we see that as being not realized in a capitalist system that creates class inequality, class exploitation. We see that in patriarchy that produces gender inequality and exploitation. But I think that what I'm really trying to get us to think more carefully about, and I do think this is sort of the direction of some of the knowledge as well. So I don't think all, but I think that what we're trying to do is like think about the political field and what it is that people actually pursue in their conception of the moral good, right? And in the pursuit of the moral good, people are invested not just in dismantling hierarchies, these social hierarchies, but they're all invested in making these hierarchies ethical, moral, habitable. And that's a big sphere of not just Islamic piety politics, but a whole type. We encounter this all the time on the left. If you do organizing, you encounter this all the time. People don't necessarily see hierarchy intrinsically the problem, right? And even in our own lives, we don't. Our relationship to our parents, our modeling relationships that we have to authority in general. We have this notion of baron ki izzat, respect for the elders, right? These things structure our approach, even as left or secular we might be, as well, right? And so I think that to understand politics from a perspective, we do need to open ourselves up to the understanding that people pursue these kind of moral visions that take hierarchy for granted, but don't just leave it intact. They see the problems in it, but they reflect on those problems in order to formulate different types of more ethically loaded hierarchies with moral force. And a lot of the world's politics is structured by that. That's not a transcendental, transformative politics, in my perspective, but it's the type of politics many people pursue in their daily lives, in their interactions with each other. And that is what I wanted this book partly to open up the fields of thinking about. That doesn't resolve, in my opinion, I argue, in that these underlying crises that are generating the fragmentation. But we do need to understand analytically and politically what it is that draws people to these types of movements and what work these movements do for people in their lives. In many ways, I argued, for instance, in earlier chapters of the book, I argued that these piety formations actually allow a lot of transformation of people's positions, people that are at the margins of national hierarchies of caste, ethnicity. Lots of people from working class backgrounds are in the Tablighi Jamaat, and through this, they acquire the kind of respectability that political hierarchies and economic hierarchies deny them. And so religious hierarchy and religion as a space becomes a principal site in modernity for the reformulation of the self, precisely because it challenges these other formulations of political authority, islands, and all of these other things. So that's what the Islamic revival, a part of the Islamic revival is about, the reformulation of one's subject position, and also of repositioning yourself in a whole world of hierarchies. And I think that politics is important to understand, and it also explains a lot of why people don't immediately take to the egalitarianism of that pitch to them. They might see that egalitarianism as immoral in ways that challenge the thing that they are actually trying to do. So that, I think, is the end.
That's a very interesting point. You don't ignore how class or caste or social presentation shape who is seen as morally credible. And so, like, what are the limitations of sort of this ethics of the Jamaat, and who gets left out of Jamaat's vision of moral authority?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, I think that I think I could have pursued this question more. In class and these things come up, but all the works have limits. I think that's a great question. It is, of course, a Sunni formation, first and foremost. That's the premise of it, right? So to create that material connection to the divine transcendent, you have to pursue a conception of the ground on which that's built, the original idea of the Prophet's community. And that's a very Sunni thing. So you're already in a sectarian vision, right? Sectarian, not in the necessarily we hate all the people who are outside of our sectarian vision, but they do fall outside of the moral community, right? And of course, non-Muslims fall outside of the moral community. Of course, there are people that are fundamentally seen as not just outside, but a threat to the moral community. So in Pakistan, we know that Ahmadis represent this kind of threat that seems to believe that is in the religious movement seen as undermining the very foundations of the religiosity and therefore particular type of threat. So these are definitely, there's no question that this has a sectarian valence to it. So, that's of course the obvious level at which, right? It's a religious formation.
It's kind of interesting. I think there are like moments in the book where working class or like rural interlocutors that struggle to be heard in these hierarchies. And there's that tension there of, exclusion and who is being
Yeah.
heard. In your mind, what happens to those individuals who don't fit the aesthetic of Jamaat or
Yeah, I think that people do find a certain sense of agency and a sense of power that they don't otherwise have from political hierarchies, right? This is a key argument of my book.
Yeah.
These religious spaces afford a possibility of entry into space and into the reformulation of the self, right? Because I argue that the very caste system that we live in is actually, in fact, it has an Islamic conception to it in the sense that low caste people are more recent converts. So people end up wanting to be incorporated into this.
That's a really important point because a lot of researchers and intellectuals in Pakistan tend to underrate the significance of caste in Pakistan society, right?
Right. And
culture.
I do place that at the center of the vision of the Muslim public, right? Is this already hierarchical caste public, right? And that intersects with the class and Ashrafia versus non-Ashraf communities. And so there are lots of people that are incorporated, but it is true, and this is, I think, an underdeveloped point in my book, but it is, of course, true that those people that are coming from the bottom feel a certain amount of power and agency in their incorporation into this structure, but the top of the hierarchies are still kind of reproduced by around the same so-called worldly statuses, right? So if you have money, you can, like I was able to get closer to the people at the top than maybe some other people would who are coming from lower classes. So I think there are these limits, and I hope other students are studying this movement, and you can only do so much work that would explore some of those tensions. They exist, they come up in my book, you can develop them. So, but this is, to go back to my point about the political, right, which is, this people still pursue these things. Just because they reach limits of these kinds does not mean they abandon the aspiration or that they don't actually somehow accept even those hierarchies. So I think that the type of relationships that, like say, working class, low caste, rural people are able to produce in the Tablighi Jamaat still has meaning and value for them as people. So there were telewalas, street vendors who sell really, who are kind of really working class, right? Poor people who I do think this space affords them a sense of place in the world that is very hard to describe unless you are interact with them. They do not interact with people. They interact with people from upper classes in a way that presupposes their own moral subjectivity. So I think that politics is extremely important, and it's extremely important for gender. It's extremely important for caste. It's extremely important for class, that people don't necessarily pursue we're going to reject all these hierarchies politics, but instead try to find their place in hierarchy. That, I think, is what the book is ultimately about, and it's a part of politics that we need to understand, because there are these certain types of egalitarian formations that also have hierarchies embedded in them, and there are these other hierarchical formations and they have egalitarianism embedded in them, and we need to tease apart this to understand the political field in a richer way. That's what these books are about, really exploring.
I think another thing which is kind of interesting, your interlocutors are almost entirely men, and I wonder how the Jamaat reshapes what it means to be a man, and how does that contrast with the more dominant or expected forms of masculinity in the context of South Asia or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean that's a central theme of it.
Yeah,
I mean, there is this sort of notion of men's agency and of men essentially being like in this situation of fitna at the source of the crisis. Men are aggressive. Men are hard of temperament. They're harsh. They spit out words that they don't know how to control their own tongues, and so they they produce fitna, right? Even though women are of course broadly seen as a source of fitna, women's sexuality, for instance, is seen as a major threat, and the word fitna itself means temptation as well as chaos, right? And so there's a gendered ideology, patriarchal ideology, and I lay out the patriarchal structure of that. But men's reform is the key focus of a movement like this, and it is about producing softer masculinity that allows men to contain and control what are seen as natural, predisposed aggressive impulses. And so that's one of the key things, the pious masculine subject formulated in the Tablighi Jamaat becomes an agent for the production of a pious family, holding people together, not being harsh, respecting elders, managing contradictions of family life, and becomes the model for an alternative sovereignty to state sovereignty. So, pious masculinity is a big theme in a lot of my work. I have those who don't want to read the book in detail, I have an article on pious masculinity, the way that gender symbolisms are mobilized to reformulate masculine subjectivity.
This is sort of a shift, but Maulana Tariq Jamil has emerged as a central figure in Pakistan's Islamic media landscape. How do you understand his sort of persona, and what does his popularity say about contemporary forms of religious authority in the Jamaat?
Yeah, so Maulana Tariq Jamil comes from the Tablighi Jamaat, of course, like he emerges out of that relationship. But, one of the points I make about to become a pious speaker, that is somebody able to convey piety and transform others, one also has to be anchored in the hierarchies of the Jamaat, right? It's like a dialectic between being out there and speaking as part of the collective, but also then embedding yourself and submitting yourself to the authority of the collective. And so that's the kind of formation, that's the set of practices that I explore in the central two chapters of the book, Semiotics of Piety. So one of the arguments that Tablighis make is that the vehicle for the proper, pure transformation of the self and of others in turn only comes from the face-to-face and the embodied travel. That's why Tablighis can be seen traveling through Pakistan cities, right? And the idea is that it is the physical struggle and striving that is the basis for which that transformation happens. So it's a kind of notion against mass-mediated forms of religiosity, right? There's this idea. Now, Tariq Jamil took what he learned from the Tablighi Jamaat, Maulana Tariq Jamil, and he pursued this in much more in his mass-mediated sense. I think that people at the bottom of the Tablighi Jamaat are very, very taken by Maulana Tariq Jamil, but I think that there is a certain amount of tension around him, because he, on the one hand, is this immense vehicle for the spread of messages that are basically in content exactly like the Tablighi Jamaat's messages, but in form, he has escaped what are seen as the disciplinary mechanisms of the Tablighi formation. And so I would say, I think that he's a subject who is a source of a certain ambivalence. One, because he has that popularity, but also because he's now escaped from within the regulatory framework of managing the cells.
Yeah,
that is key to the job.
Yeah, so I was going to ask. So, like, the concept of Dawat, is seen as initially embodied, but you also show how it circulates online. What changes when this ethical invitation becomes digital?
Yeah.
And does it moral grammar change or anything of that nature?
I believe it's the type of question we ask ourselves all the time. What's the difference between going and organizing, face to face and bringing people together and tweeting, like we ask this question ourselves, right? It's not a question unique to the Tablighi Jamaat. It is a question that's fundamental. What happens inside mass-mediated space when the organizing structure of the mediated space is different from the organizing structure of the communal gathering of whatever kind, right? And so that is a fundamental question of the types of mediation and what they do. Concept affordances, right? This comes from science and technology studies. An affordance of a material object is, a chair says here, this is structured in such a way such that it invites you to sit, but you can or cannot take it up, right? I mean, you can also throw a chair. You can do lots of things with a chair, right? You can stand on it to fix the fan. But it has something inside of it that says this is how it's supposed to be used. Mass media, we know, have these internal mechanisms and structures. They produce us as much as, right? We only can do so much with them, right? Twitter only allows so many things. It has certain kinds of fun. So what happens in mass mediated sermons? Well, that's a source of investigation that lots of people are doing. People are studying that in anthropology and their interest in mass media and religion. I was interested in that question as well, but I was also interested in the question of why Tablighis reject that. And the reason Tablighis reject that is because they think it produces, the metaphor from it is heat, right? Like the Jamaat is cooling, it cools the passions. But the publicity of being out in front of everyone, that makes you say, their idea is that it makes you say undisciplined things. So, right? So and they're right. This is the truth. I mean, there's some fundamental truth that they're getting at that we also will recognize, right? Like when when you get an audience, you end up becoming enamored by yourself and saying things that may depart from the original message of Islam, right? And so it produces this kind of heating of passion. The Tablighi Jamaat involves standing in front of a crowd and giving sermons, for instance, in the masjid. But that produces the ideologies that produces passion that's important because that's what gets you really into it. But then that passion has to be molded and shaped. The metaphor for this is like a vase, right? Like you heat the glass and it becomes moldable, but then you have to cool it and shape it. And so the congregational life of then sobat is the concept, companionship is what molds people into shape. So mass media does not produce sobat in the way that material space does. And that's their understanding. It can extend the content. They would often say, Tabligis would often say, that this appeals to the brain, it doesn't appeal to the heart, which means it doesn't transform the subject in the same way. So these are the kinds of ideologies we call these media ideologies. Right? Like these are ideologies of language. That's to say, there's a certain idea about what language is and how it works, and there are ideas about media, what media are and how it works. And there's actually objective truth to some of the things they're saying about what media is capable of doing. Right? I mean, it does promote a certain kind of, they say takabbur, right? A certain kind of arrogance, right? It produces in us a tendency, and therefore leftists should take this heat of this as well and say, there's some amount of stuff we can do online and that's maybe important, but at the ground level, you've got to produce the Jamaat. You've got to go and do the groundwork. And that groundwork disciplines the subject. And I don't think Tablighis are unique in thinking about that.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of lesson actually that one can learn from other types of movements, right? That labor organizing or organizing is a different kind of labor than tweeting. That's just how we should be thinking about the things they're thinking about are not that different from the things left movement.
Yeah. In your recent article, you argue that the Jamaat isn't simply opposed to liberal public reason; it forms a parallel ethical order. What kinds of counter politics does this open, and how should we understand its refusal to be political in conventional terms?
So I think the idea that the Islamic piety is this counter to liberal secularism has been done. But in Pakistan, it also produces a counter to many other types of Islamic formations, right? Again, this goes back to the point about plural context, including the Islamic State, right? So Pakistan has other, so political Islam of the kind that has a religion as a state ideology is also something that threatens the formation of so the state has to be managed, and there's a certain amount of ambivalence towards the state. But state religiosity that has been pushed by political parties and stuff entangles Islam with all kinds of other forms of mediation and other forms of public formation. So these are the kinds of tensions that I got very interested in exploring. And I said, like I said before in the beginning of my book, liberal secularism is one type of public formation and process, right? But there are all these others that are circulating. And even though they're different, they're not fundamentally different. They share a desire to produce a transcendental kind of public in which there is a particular idea of the sovereign subject. I call this sovereign transcendence, right? They all have the sovereign transcendence of modernity. That is the idea of producing a particular order around a type of subject, whether that be the liberal individual, or it be the pious subject, or it be the Marxist subject, right? The Marxist. So I think that there it is worth unpacking the potentialities of modernities, possibilities of, and the tensions of different kinds of transcendence as they're materialized in practice. Tensions between anarchists and communists are like kind of like tensions between Islamists, right? Because Islamists have a notion of a state model that is going to produce, right? And anarchists say, no, we got to produce the good society, and the good society out of which you can't do it with state forms, right? And so I've always been told I've been told by reviewers I should write a comparative study of tablighis who have a different model of sociality and anarchists, but there is a parallel. This is a tension that arises around state power and how to formulate the good, the community, right? The nation, the public, and so on. So yeah, that is the kind of thing that the book does take up, right? The Tablighis have an idea of, it's called prefigurative politics, the politics of formulating the community, out of which will come this sovereign state. And Islamists say, well, if you don't have law, Islamic law, and all these things, then Muslims will. So there are different contests over the nature of sovereign power and over the state form.
So to wrap up the interview, what are you working on next? And are you continuing the questions of piety and ethics, or moving into a new terrain?
Yeah, I thought about pursuing other projects around piety, but honestly, I feel like I want to move on from that. I'm still interested in ethical formations and the communal formations, and I'm also interested in cross, in the same way that Tablighi Jamaat is a cross caste and cross class kind of formation. So I was thinking of trying to understand some of that in other spheres of life. I haven't quite formulated that, but like I'm trying to think about climate politics now and political economy and of that. And so, one thing I'm looking into is housing and housing rights in Karachi, and how people come to think about housing and housing rights, and how they produce some kinds of publics around that. So that's one angle, and I haven't really in its stages. And so I'm trying to think about something else. But I think that the themes that I developed in my first project, this has to do with the skills I have that I think maybe other people working on similar topics may not have. Like this sort of ability to analyze micro-interactional forms that I get from linguistic anthropology, rituals and the semiotics of rituals, and the types of relationships that are formulated. I'm going to say one last thing I think that I get asked a lot. People who follow me on other spaces, like, I'm a pretty conventional left-wing socialist politics, right? Yeah, and why should we all care about these things? I mean, I do think that we need to couple our analysis of political economy, what we get, say, from Marx or something, to the microanalysis of these kinds of formations. If we really want to think about class struggle, right? What is it that draws people into these kinds of movements versus other kinds of possibilities? Right? What is it that structures that difference that matters to people in their visions of the good? To me, the things I study are about the formation of relational dynamics, and those relational dynamics in ritual and religion. But really, I'm interested in the fundamental thing that is going to pursue in my next project is really about, right, like these are many of the people that are in the these are massive, millions and millions of people are in it. Like, that is a major public they're able to form, and they do it through the nitty-gritty micro politics of interactional ethics, right? And we do need a framework for thinking about interactional ethics, also for those of us who have left-wing understandings of the world and want to challenge capital and patriarchy and these other things. And so I think that it really does help us to think outside of our conventional about how spread, grow, and we are able to produce a mass public or a mass social formation. So that is the same thing I want to pursue in the micro outward into thinking about, the crisis that we see all around us, that they also see. They also see the same crisis, but they are looking at it at a different angle. They're looking at it from the perspective of piety, and they have a different set of solutions. But those are very compelling to many people. And therefore, it's very interesting to think what is compelling.
Absolutely. You've really inspired us with your work, and this was an extremely engaging conversation. This was our conversation with Arsalan Khan. If it opened something for you, if it made you pause and rethink, please like, share, and subscribe. These conversations matter because they ask us not just to observe, but to confront the worlds we inherit and the ones we make. If you'd like to support this work, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.